The first thing Eleanor Pike felt was the weight of the cold pressing through the thin soles of her boots, as if winter itself had decided she was no longer worth sparing. And she stood there at the long, scarred counter with her late husband's tools laid out in a careful line, each one cleaned by hand the night before, though her fingers had bled from it, because she could not bear to offer them dirty, not after what they had built and failed to protect, and the smell of iron and old pine mixed, with lamp oil wrapped around her chest until breathing felt like a debt she could no longer afford, while outside the frost clung to the windows in white, clawed patterns that looked like they were trying to get in, or perhaps keep her from leaving, and she told herself again that this was only business, that grief could not be fed to a child nor traded for flour, that love once buried did not keep the stomach quiet at night, and yet every plane and chisel resting on the counter carried the echo of her husband's hands, strong and steady once, laughing as he showed her how to hold a saw straight, promising her that no matter how hard the winter came, they would stand through it together, promises that now lay as broken as the fence rails on their empty plot of land. The shopkeeper across from her, old Amos Cutter, dipped his pen and squinted at the tools like a man pricing cattle rather than the remains of a life. And when he spoke, his voice was flat, careful, already practiced in disappointment, telling her what each piece might fetch, how the market had soured, how iron was plentiful and money scarce. And Eleanor nodded because nodding was easier than begging, easier than admitting she had counted the coins in her pocket 10 times on the walk into town and still come up short. And as Amos pushed the total toward her, sliding the paper like an apology that did not dare look her in the eye, she felt something in her chest sink, knowing it would not last a week, knowing that she would return again with something else from the house until there was nothing left but walls and silence. That was when the bell over the door gave a low, tired ring, and the air shifted. Not loudly, not with drama, but with the unmistakable presence of a man who had spent his life deciding things others lived with. And Eleanor did not turn at first because she had learned how to make herself small, how to finish a transaction without drawing the notice of those who could afford not to care. But Amos did look up, his shoulders stiffening just enough to betray respect, and said the man's name like it was a known weight, Jonah Blackwell, spoken the way one speaks of weather that can ruin a season. And Eleanor felt the name before she understood it, felt it in the stillness that followed, in the way the lantern flame trembled, though no wind had passed. Jonah Blackwell stood tall and spare in a dark coat worn thin at the edges, his hat pulled low, his beard touched with gray that did not soften his eyes that had seen land claimed and lost, men broken by debt and pride. And when he stepped closer, his boots made no unnecessary sound, yet Eleanor knew he was there with the certainty one feels a storm gathering over open ground. And he looked at the tools, not with the hunger of a buyer, but with the recognition of a man who knew what honest work cost. His gaze moving slow, measuring, lingering on a plane whose handle had been reshaped to fit a familiar grip. And Eleanor felt an irrational urge to tell him that her husband had done that he had taken pride in making things right, even when the world did not return the favor. But she said nothing because pride had not saved him from the fever, nor her from this moment. And Jonah finally spoke, his voice low and even, asking Amos where the tools came from. And when Amos gestured toward Eleanor with a tilt of his chin, Jonah turned his attention to her fully, not with pity, which would have been easier to endure, but with a steady regard that made her feel suddenly visible in a way she had not been since the ground closed over the grave. And he asked her name, and she gave it. And when he asked whose tools they were, she told the truth, because lies took more strength than she had left, saying they belonged to her husband, that he was gone, that she was selling what remained, and the words felt like stones placed one by one on her own chest. Jonah nodded once, slowly, and in that nod there was no judgment, only acceptance of a fact that did not need explanation. And he asked how much Amos had offered, and when Eleanor told him, Jonah's eyes flicked to the paper, then back to the tools, and something passed through his expression like a shadow crossing a field. And he reached into his coat and laid more money on the counter than Amos had written, not carelessly, not as a show, but as if correcting a wrong that should never have existed. And Amos opened his mouth to speak but thought. Better of it, because Jonah Blackwell was not a man one argued with over numbers. Eleanor stared at the coins, her breath caught between gratitude and something sharper, something that felt like being bought along with the iron and wood, and she said she could not accept it, that the price had been agreed, that charity was not what she had come for, and Jonah studied her then, truly studied her, from the calluses on her hands to the way she stood straight despite the tremor in her voice. And he said quietly that it was not charity, that tools were worth what they could still do in the right hands, and that he intended to put them back to work. And as he spoke, Eleanor felt the ground tilt beneath her certainty, because there was an implication there she did not yet understand but could feel closing in. And Jonah asked her if she knew how to use them, really knew. And she told him she did, that she had learned alongside her husband, that there had been no choice but to learn when survival demanded it. And Jonah looked at her for a long moment, long enough that the shop seemed to fade, long enough that Eleanor felt seen, not as a widow but as a sum of decisions yet to be made. And then he said he could. Use someone like that on his ranch, someone steady, someone who did not break when the world did. And the words fell between them like a bridge, half-built, promising passage, but offering no guarantee it would hold. And Eleanor felt fear rise alongside a fragile, dangerous hope. Because to accept would mean leaving the last pieces of the life she had known, and to refuse would mean returning to hunger with pride as her only companion. And as she looked at the coins, at the tools that had been her past and might yet shape her future. Jonah Blackwell waited, unmoving, while winter pressed its white hands against the glass, and Eleanor understood that whatever she chose next would decide more than where she slept. It would decide who she would be allowed to become, and the silence stretched tight enough to break. Begins the moment Eleanor Pike chose to step forward. Because choice in the West was never gentle, it was a door slammed shut behind you, while another opened into wind and risk. And she followed Jonah Blackwell out of Amos Cutter's shop, with the coins heavy in her pocket and the tools bundled like a future she was not sure she deserved, the cold biting harder now as if testing her resolve. And she told herself she was doing this for survival, for bread and heat and the simple mercy of not watching the walls close in on an empty house. Yet as Jonah's wagon carried them away from town, she felt something else stirring, something like a buried instinct waking after too long in the dark. Blackwell Ranch rose from the land with a stark honesty. No grand flourishes, just fences set straight and buildings worn but strong, the kind of place that endured because it had been built by hands that did not expect mercy. And Jonah spoke little as they arrived, showing her the bunkhouse she would use, the work that needed doing, the hours that would start before dawn and end only when the light gave out. And Eleanor listened with a calm. She did not fully feel, because every word tied her tighter to a life she had not planned. Yet, when he placed the tools on the workbench and asked her to show him what she could do, something settled in her chest, a quiet certainty born of memory and muscle. And she worked with a focus that surprised even herself, fitting joints, repairing gates, setting right what had been left to sag and fail. And Jonah watched from a distance, not hovering, not correcting, but seeing. And in that watching, there was respect growing slow and sure, like roots beneath hard ground. Days turned into weeks. Winter dug in its heels, and Eleanor found that work had a way of softening grief without erasing it. That each repaired beam felt like a small defiance against the losses she carried. And Jonah, for his part, found himself measuring time differently, noticing the way the ranch breathed easier under her care, the way silence between them was no longer heavy but companionable. And though neither spoke of the past, it lived there with them, shaping every careful glance and restrained word, because Jonah had lost too. A wife taken years before by a riding accident that left him with land and responsibility, but no one to share the weight. And he had learned to lock that part of himself away where it could not interfere with survival. The turning point came one night when a storm rolled in fierce and sudden, tearing at the fences and threatening the livestock, and Eleanor worked alongside Jonah without hesitation, hands numb, hair whipped loose from her scarf. And when a beam collapsed and nearly crushed her, Jonah pulled her clear with a force born of fear he had not felt in years, holding her longer than necessary as the storm howled around them. And in that moment, both understood what had been growing unspoken between them. Not that romance born of softness, but connection forged under pressure, dangerous because it made something worth losing again. Afterward, sitting by the fire, Eleanor finally spoke of her husband, not with tears, but with a steady voice that honored what had been, and Jonah listened without trying to fix what could not be fixed. And when he spoke of his own loss, it was brief but honest, and the firelight caught the lines of regret and endurance in his face, and they saw in each other not replacements for the dead, but companions willing to stand in the aftermath. Spring came slowly, as it always did, and with it a chance to choose again, and Jonah offered Eleanor more than wages, offering her a permanent place on the ranch, a share in the work and the decisions, not as a favor, but as recognition of her worth. And Eleanor felt fear rise once more, because acceptance meant allowing herself to belong again, to risk the kind of pain that only mattered when something truly mattered. Yet she thought of the tools, of how iron could be reshaped, how wood could be given new purpose without denying its grain. And she accepted, not as a widow being rescued, but as a woman claiming her place. The ranch prospered not because fate had softened, but because two people chose to meet it head on. And though love came later, quiet and earned, it was built on shared labor and respect, the kind that could survive hard seasons. And Eleanor sometimes stood at the edge of the fields at dusk, thinking of how close she had come to disappearing, how one choice at a counter in a small town had redirected her destiny. And Jonah would join her without words, both of them knowing that survival was never just about living through the cold, but about daring to build something after it. And if this story stirred something in you, if you felt the weight of choice and the strength it takes to stand again after loss, then remember that stories like this live and breathe because of you. So subscribe to The Western Tales, where every frontier of the heart is explored, every hard-earned destiny honored, and every voice that refuses to be broken finds a place to be heard.